Perfectionism is a serious issue facing many students today. I want to talk to you about perfectionism and specifically how it affects gifted students, where it comes from, and how we can support students that struggle with perfectionism. I hope you find some helpful information today, and I hope you find something useful that you can take away and use to support students that struggle with perfectionism. Thanks.
What is perfectionism? Most authors will define it differently depending on what they're emphasizing in their research. What I've chosen to do is take the four most common traits in all the definitions and all the research I've seen and present those to you and explain them a little bit. The first trait is holding to unrealistically high standards. Most of the students that struggle with perfectionism are typically able to reach high standards. This is especially true of gifted and talented students. The key here is unrealistic. These students hold themselves to higher standards than their parents, their teachers, their classmates. They hold themselves to higher standards than the work they're doing actually requires. The second trait is that they are never satisfied by the quality of work that they put forth. So, for instance, a student may finish a project a week early and then spend 1 or 2 hours a day working on that project, even though they're already finished. They don't want to turn it in because they're obsessing over every detail, every piece that they don't believe is up to the standard that they've set for themselves. They're never satisfied, even when they turn the project in and they don't feel like moving on to the next thing because they're worried about the grade that they're going to get on that. That's a very common trait among students that struggle with perfectionism. The third trait is feeling guilt over not working or achieving. For instance, they may have finished all their work and they have nothing to work on at this point, but they start to feel guilt that they're not working on something. And so they look for work to do. They obsess about what they've already turned in, or they're trying to get ahead even though there's nothing for them to really work on. They feel guilt about not actually accomplishing things every moment of the day. The fourth trait is one of the most important pieces of this whole presentation. Students that struggle with perfectionism tend to equate what they're doing, their achievement, with their identity. They view the grades they get and the compliments they get or the criticism they get as who they are. They cannot separate who they are from the work they're doing and the feedback they're getting. This makes them feel good if they achieve. If they're successful, then they feel that they're a success. But it creates a lot of issues if they fail because then they feel that they themselves are a failure. So keep those four traits in mind as we move through the rest of this presentation. And I want to make one other note. For this presentation, I'm going to assume that perfectionism is negative. There is talk of healthy perfectionism, and we will address that later on in the presentation. But for this presentation, we will view perfectionism as a barrier to being successful and to identity. How common is perfectionism? Research shows between 20 and 30% of all students are negatively affected by perfectionism. Depending on the source you find, you'll look at different numbers. But most of the studies that have been done have shown that in all student groups, nearly 25% of all students struggle with perfectionism. There's a myth going around that gifted students struggle with perfectionism more than non-gifted students. While that seems to make sense, the research doesn't support that. The research actually shows that gifted students struggle with perfectionism at the same rate as non-gifted students. There is, however, evidence to suggest that gifted students struggle with perfectionism to a higher degree, but certainly they arrive at their perfectionism through a different set of circumstances than non-gifted students. So while perfectionism isn't a gifted-only issue, for gifted students, it is a uniquely gifted issue, and it will be addressed as such throughout this presentation. There are three main types of perfectionism. Researchers will debate nuances and details, but there's consensus on these three types. The first is self-oriented perfectionism. These students are highly demanding of themselves. These are the students that equate their identity with their level of success. These are the students that if they succeed, they feel like they're successful, and if they fail, they feel like they themselves are failures. They set goals for themselves that are unrealistically high. They expect more from themselves than anyone else around them expects from them. These students get defeated when they experience failure. They cannot cope with failure, and they feel worthless when they fail. Their driving motivation for all the work they do is a fear of failure. They're not driven to get ahead because they want to be ahead. They're driven to get ahead because they don't want to fall behind. To them, failure attacks their identity, and that is unacceptable. The second type of perfectionism is socially prescribed perfectionism. This type of student derives their expectations from others, typically their parents, but sometimes their teachers or their peers. They look at the expectations those people have for them, and they try to meet them. They try to be perfect for the expectations around them. These students feel external pressure to be perfect. Now, I want to make a note here. This pressure may not actually exist. The people around them may not care about them being perfect, or may have good standards for them, but not perfect standards for them. But the student feels that pressure and perceives it as real. Often, most often, it comes from their parents. They want to live up to their parents' expectations for them. They think their parents want them to be perfect. Whether or not that's true, that's how the child feels, and that's how they respond to it. They respond to it by attempting to be perfect. Unlike self-oriented perfectionism, a socially prescribed perfectionist fears punishment instead of failure. They feel being criticized or being punished for not being perfect, and this fear drives them to attempt to be perfect. The third type of perfectionism is others-oriented perfectionism. This student most likely has high expectations for themselves, but others-oriented perfectionism is when they are highly demanding of other people, so not themselves. They expect everyone else to hold the same high standards they hold for themselves. Again, we're speaking about unrealistically high expectations. So while they hold high standards for themselves, they have an unrealistic expectation for everyone else around them. They expect the world to run perfectly, and they're very frustrated when it doesn't. Self-oriented perfectionists fear failure because it attacks their identity. Socially prescribed perfectionists fear punishment or criticism. Others-oriented perfectionists fear being let down or having unmet expectations. They have a need to control everything, and they fear being out of control or not having things go the way they want. Toward the beginning, I mentioned healthy perfectionism. There is no consensus among researchers as to whether healthy perfectionism is really perfectionism or whether it's healthy. The indicators of healthy perfectionism are high quality work, especially incredibly detailed work. A student with healthy perfectionism holds incredibly high expectations for themselves, but also allows for growth from any failure that they experience. Their focus is on improvement and learning rather than focusing on fear of failure. Where does perfectionism originate in a child? There are several places. The first is that perfectionism is simply innate to the child. A child is born with a disposition toward perfectionism, that high quality work and the stress that comes along with being perfect. These children are naturally highly critical of themselves and or others. Oftentimes they view the world as all or nothing. It has to be this way, and it can't be that way. Research links neuroticism specifically with socially prescribed perfectionism. Neuroticism being one of the big 5 personality traits. It's linked with anxiety, depression, those negative feelings, intense feelings that students feel. That's linked with socially prescribed perfectionism, which is where a student will derive their expectations from the people around them. Another personality trait is conscientiousness. That is specifically linked with self-oriented perfectionism. Conscientiousness is linked with detail-oriented and setting highly demanding goals, and so it's not hard to see why that would be linked with self-oriented perfectionism, which is where students have high pressure for themselves and their expectations are internal. Dabrowski's work on overexcitabilities is a common theoretical framework to view gifted education. Gifted students are often seen as overly excitable in one of several areas: psychomotor, sensual, intellectual, imaginational, and emotional. There is research that shows a link between high emotional excitability and perfectionism in general. That same research also shows that having high imaginational overexcitability is linked to unhealthy perfectionism, while having low imaginational overexcitability is actually linked to having healthy perfectionism. Perfectionism is also linked with parenting styles. Before I jump into parenting styles, I want to point out that the child's perception of their parent's parenting style is more important than their actual parenting style. Perfectionism develops as a child becomes aware of the parenting style that they believe they're being parented in, rather than when that parenting style actually takes place. Authoritarian parenting is signaled by having high expectations combined with low affection or validation. There is a direct link between authoritarian parenting and socially prescribed perfectionism. This can occur when a parent has an expectation for their child, the child doesn't meet it, whether they tried to meet it or not, and then the parent does not show affection. Over time, the child becomes aware of this and fears punishment or not being accepted by their parents, and they learn socially prescribed perfectionism. Another alternative is that they might view their siblings being treated that way by their parents and then believe that that expectation is on them as well. Or they might learn it from watching how their parents treat other people that are not part of their family. One of the unexpected findings in the research is that absent parenting can also lead to perfectionism. Absent parenting is signaled by having low expectations and then also having low affection or validation. Interestingly enough, absent parenting is actually linked more with self-oriented perfection than any other type of perfection. The theory is that the absence of expectations from the authority leads to a need for creating expectations. The child then has no standard to go by, so they set the only standard they can come up with, which for some children is perfectionism, and then they hold themselves to that standard to create the structure that is absent in their lives. The development of perfectionism also takes into account environmental factors. Since the focus of this presentation is perfectionism in gifted children, I'm going to focus on the environmental factors that specifically affect gifted children. Some of these factors may affect other children as well, but I'm going to focus on factors that affect specifically gifted children. Gifted children are significantly more likely to experience isolation from relationships with their peers. There are a variety of reasons for that, but the research is clear that they experience isolation at a significantly higher rate than other children. Isolation is directly connected to anxiety and depression, which are linked with perfectionism. Perfectionism may lead to anxiety and depression, but also anxiety and depression may lead to perfectionism. One of the common links between those ideas is isolation. Another environmental factor is unfair expectations. Children who are labeled as gifted oftentimes face expectations because of that label of being gifted. Oftentimes adults think students that are gifted should not struggle with learning. Gifted students often think this about themselves. They think that learning should not be a struggle, and when they struggle, they've got that label of being gifted, and they feel like it's an assault on their identity. Maybe they're not gifted. So they feel the need to be perfect in order to prove that they're actually gifted. Early success. I'm going to describe a scenario for you. A student with naturally high intellect is put into a class with others who are pretty typical. A lot of education tends to teach towards the middle, so the student with naturally high intellect is very exceptional. They get perfect scores, they do well, they're clearly above the other students in terms of grades. That early success leads them to think that they're going to challenge themselves to just always be perfect. And then they do pretty well with that for a while, until they hit middle school or high school, until they hit content that is actually difficult for them. They've come to believe that they're always perfect and that's who they are, and this new content creates an identity crisis for them. Much like the unfair expectations, they begin to believe that they are no longer gifted because they're not doing as well as they used to. As the content increases in difficulty, they still expect the same results. This can lead to perfectionism in these gifted children. Now I want to address the negative impact of perfectionism. We briefly mentioned some health concerns earlier, but I want to reiterate how serious perfectionism is. Perfectionism is often paired with anxiety and depression, and in some cases suicide. Also, perfectionism is often paired with eating disorders. These health concerns are incredibly serious. If you see any signs of these in yourself or someone else, you need to contact a trained professional. Another possible negative impact of perfectionism is immobility or procrastination. Students who feel the need to be perfect and to achieve perfection often find that overwhelming. Oftentimes, students won't even start a task at all if they feel like they can't achieve perfection. This is why high ability students often don't turn in work. It's not because they can't do it or they didn't want to do it. It's because they felt they had to be perfect and they didn't think that they could actually do that. And so that was so overwhelming that they never did anything at all. Also, it might show up in procrastination. A student might know well in advance that they have an assignment and want to work on it, but feel so overwhelmed by achieving the goal of perfection that they put it off until the last possible minute. That's often how students are identified as being perfectionists, is through that type of incident. Another negative impact is a lack of risk taking. Maybe a high ability student doesn't want to try a higher level course because they don't feel like they can get 100. Maybe they're a really strong student in one area, but they're not strong in another area, and so they don't even attempt that area or pretend they're not good at that area because they can't do it perfectly. This lack of risk-taking also shows up in a lot of non-academic areas as well. A student who is academically geared may not try an extracurricular activity because they're so used to being perfect and feeling the need to be perfect academically, and they don't feel like they can translate that into a non-academic area. It's important to remember that while these are often symptoms of perfectionism, they're how most students are identified as being perfectionists. And this is actually a good thing in order for them to find help. And now we arrive at the most practical part of this presentation. We're going to talk about what you can do to support yourself if you struggle with perfectionism, or what you can do to support students that struggle with perfectionism. When supporting a student with perfectionism, the most important thing to remember is that any steps you take to support that student have to be in the context of addressing perfectionism directly. The research shows that if you try to indirectly address perfectionism, you try to support a student without actually calling it perfectionism, or if you're a student and you don't admit to actually struggling with perfectionism, that any treatment you do, any support that you try will not be incredibly effective. It might help a little bit, but it won't take care of the problem. So I want to start with how students can help support themselves. Stress. That's what most of these students are dealing with. They're dealing with stress and guilt. So stress relieving activities can be really helpful. Things like breathing exercises. And there's a whole bunch of those things that you can look up. You can talk to a counselor about. Breathing exercises are simple, quick, in-the-moment ways to deal with the stress that you're feeling. To reduce that stress, it might not take it away completely, but it'll help you deal with it. Positive self-talk, helping yourself, talking through yourself. You can do this. I know you can do this. You don't need to be perfect. You need to do your best. Encouraging yourself. That type of positive self-talk is another in-the-moment thing you can do. Also, positive notes to self. Instead of talking through it yourself, because you might be in the emotion at the moment. You might be in that context where you're feeling stressed, you're feeling the need to be perfect, and you may not be able to talk yourself out of it. But if you've already written a note, maybe on a note card, maybe in a place you see it on the mirror, or before you take every test, you bring this out. Before you start every assignment, you bring this note card out, and it says, you don't need to be perfect. You can do this. You are enough. You are worth it. It's got to be in your own words. It has to be in your own words. That's what will make it powerful. But if it's in your own words and you're telling yourself truth, you're speaking truth to yourself, you're telling yourself what is true about yourself and that you don't need to be perfect and you don't need to do these things, that can be incredibly powerful in calming you down and helping you get started and get through those stressful moments. Journaling is another fantastic activity. This is less in the moment, although you can certainly journal in the moment, but keeping a journal, sharing your thoughts with yourself, writing them out, getting them out on paper so that you can work through this stress, the anxiety, the frustration yourself, and have a place to write that and get it out so you're not holding it in, can be incredibly powerful. And one of the most practical things you can do in helping to reduce stress is having a hobby or an activity that is outside of what you're working on. If you are stressed about school, it's not going to be helpful for you to do a different school assignment because that might stress you out too. But if you play a sport or an instrument, if you like to write, maybe you write a book or you write fiction on your own, or if you like to play games or go for a walk, go hiking, do something active, something that is going to be stress relieving rather than stress inducing is going to be helpful. Now, we're not talking about just sitting down and binge watching TV. You're not really doing an activity at that point. The key is that it's an activity. So maybe it's a hobby. Maybe you like to make things. You like to craft. You like to do something like that. Those activities can actually help reduce your stress, and then you're more prepared to go back to doing the things that you're supposed to do. Research shows that if you take time away from the thing that's stressing you out and you do some things that let you relieve that stress, you're actually going to be more successful and be able to work at a higher level when you come back to it. One other real practical thing you can do is study someone who's successful but who also struggled. Read a biography. Go do some research. Look at most anyone who is truly successful and you'll see that they struggled through different things. Find somebody that you look up to, somebody whose life sounds interesting. How did they get there? What did they have to go through? And look up a biography. Do some research. Most of the time, it doesn't even take a lot of research to do, and you can find out that other people struggled too. And what that tells you is that struggle doesn't define them, and that's what you need to hear. Your struggle doesn't define you. You can overcome that. The last thing that you absolutely have to do, it's one of the most important things you do, is share your feelings with your parents and your teachers. Share with them how stressed you feel. Advocate for yourself, because oftentimes, teachers, we might not notice that you're feeling so stressed. Parents might not notice that you're feeling so stressed. You need to advocate for yourself and start that conversation with your parents, with your teachers, so that they can surround you and support you through that. You can overcome perfectionism, and I hope you find these tips helpful for you. So now I want to shift focus to what the adults in a student's life can do to support those students. Instead of doing teachers and parents separately, I've decided to address teachers and parents together because I think most of the things that you can do to support these students are overlapping between parents and teachers. There might be some that gear more towards a parent or more towards a teacher, but overall, most of these things can be done by both teachers and parents. The absolute most important thing you can do to support a student struggling with perfectionism is to communicate acceptance and love regardless of performance. Failure happens, mistakes happen, and even if a student didn't try their hardest in some cases, or you don't believe they did, that student should still be accepted and loved. Maybe encouraged to do better, but especially if you know a student struggling with perfectionism, encouraging them to do better sometimes, they oftentimes know that they need to do better, or that they feel they need to do better, and the pressure they'll put on themselves is going to be more powerful than a reminder you give them. Always communicate acceptance and love to a student, especially a student that's struggling with perfectionism. Second, be understanding of the pressure students face. The society puts more and more pressure on students to perform at higher levels. Whether it's an educational initiative or it's a college acceptance, these things put more and more pressure on students, and perfectionists are already putting pressure on themselves or feeling pressure from other people. So be understanding of the pressure these students face. It's not fake, it's not imaginary. Even if the pressure isn't there from you and you feel that the student is feeling that pressure that's not there, they still feel it and it's still real to them, and you do need to be very understanding of that. Emphasize a growth mindset. Carol Dweck has done incredible work on the growth mindset over the last several years, and many teachers are noticing this. A lot of parents are not aware of it. I highly encourage you to go look up research, do some reading on Carol Dweck's work. Growth mindset is powerful. This is as opposed to a fixed mindset. Most students that struggle with perfectionism have a fixed mindset. They believe that their intelligence is locked in and they cannot grow, they cannot improve that intelligence. That's not true, and the growth mindset points that out. Every time a child fails, a growth mindset uses that failure to improve learning. It's an opportunity to learn and to grow and to do better. And if you have a child that comes home, they bring home work and they talk about what they weren't successful, then use that as an opportunity to learn. Guide them on how they can do better. Point out that this is just one grade out of 100 grades they'll get in a year, and that they can use this as an opportunity to do better next time. If you're a teacher, this is incredibly important. It's why it's become so common to hear about the growth mindset in education. But if you're a teacher, you should be encouraging all your students to try to learn, to try to grow, to try to become better after every time that they make a mistake, they don't get the level of achievement they want to get. Emphasize a growth mindset. And also emphasize effort over achievement. That's another thing about growth mindset. You have to remember that achievement is a result of ability oftentimes. And yes, applied ability, but ability. Effort is a character issue, and character is far more important than ability. Emphasize effort, reward effort, encourage effort, praise effort. If you only appraise achievement, what you're telling students is that achievement is all that matters. And yes, achievement's great. We want our students to achieve high levels and to be successful. But ultimately, effort is a character issue, and effort is something you can always improve on. Emphasize effort over achievement. Focus on the growth mindset. Teach the growth mindset to your students. Research the growth mindset yourself and use those lessons from Carol Dweck to support the students that you have or the children you have. Several other things that you can do that are a little bit more practical, tangible to support students that are struggling with perfectionism are model healthy patterns of dealing with failure. You deal with failure. You communicate that to all the children in your life, to the children that are looking up to you, whether they're your kids or they're your students. When you struggle, when things are hard for you, how do you deal with that? Do you view it as the end of the world, as an assault on your identity, or do you view it as an opportunity to learn and to grow? Your children are watching you, and the way you model that healthy behavior will determine how they deal with it. Also, introduce your child to successful people who struggled. Now, I mentioned this to the children, to the students that are struggling with perfectionism, but it's also helpful for you to do. Students, oftentimes if they're struggling with perfectionism, they're not going to be able to pull themselves out of it and do some of these things. So it's oftentimes your responsibility to step in and give them tangible things to do, like have them read a biography. You know who struggled. You know successful people. You know a lot more successful people than they do. It might be a real person that you actually know you could have them sit down and talk with, or it might be a famous person that's successful that you know struggled, and you can introduce that child to that person, whether face-to-face, or give them a biography, or just tell them a quick story about a successful person who struggled. Students who struggle with perfectionism want to identify with people who are successful. And if they recognize that those people who are successful also struggled and overcame and grew from it, that's a chance for them to identify with that and help overcome their perfectionism. If you're an adult in the life of one of these students, it's your responsibility to help them through this. And that means helping them come up with achievable goals that focus on learning and improvement. Students are going to set unachievable goals. They're going to set unrealistic goals. That's part of what they do. Because they're immature, they don't have that perspective you have. So if you can help them set achievable goals, you can help them set short-term goals and long-term goals. Goals that focus on learning a skill or improvement over time rather than getting this grade or this level of achievement. If they can focus on learning and growing, that's going back to that growth mindset, and that will help them over time to be less stressed about their goals and recognizing that, yeah, they can get to this point and it might not happen in the time frame they want, and it doesn't have to be a specific number, but it's something they can do that you can sit down and be a part of their life and helping them with that. Encourage manageable risk-taking. Students who struggle with perfectionism are not going to want to take risks. We already talked about why, but they feel like they need to be perfect and they don't want to take a risk if it might not work out for them. As parents, as teachers, we want our children to take risks that are manageable, things that are out of their comfort zone, because when you're out of your comfort zone, you can grow. You can't grow in your comfort zone. You can't become better. But if you get stuck feeling like you need to achieve a certain grade, a certain level, then you're going to feel like, I don't want to try something that I can't be successful on. as a teacher, as an adult, you can step in and say, no, we're going to try this. And it might be hard for that student in the moment, but you know it's best for them. And that's one of those situations where as an adult in their life, you're going to find things that you can encourage them to do that they may never have thought of, that they wouldn't have tried on their own. And then you can be part of helping them move through that perfectionism into the desire to grow and become better. My last suggestion is to support hobbies, non-school activities. If all a student cares about is school and they're stressed about that, you can help take some of that stress off them by encouraging them to pursue non-school activities. Encourage them to try to play a sport. They don't have to be the best. They don't have to go do travel, whatever. They can just play a sport for fun. They can play a pickup game or just do an activity outside of that schoolwork that stresses them out. And then what they'll find is they have more energy to go back and do their best in those school activities. Take part in their hobbies. If they like to play a game or if they like to listen to music or they do some of these things, be willing to encourage that. Be willing to have them pursue different activities like creating things. If they've got artistic abilities, if they've got music abilities, if they've got other things that they want to just try. It might seem crazy and they may only do it once. They may want to join a club. They may want to do martial arts. They may want to go skiing. They may want to do one of these random things that you never would have thought of, but they want to try it, and encourage that, because any activity they're doing where they're not already great at it, but they're learning and they're pursuing growth and they just simply want to enjoy it and get better, those activities reduce their stress and also teach them that learning is more important than achieving. Do your best not to be a barrier to students taking risks and trying those things. Encourage them, support them. Children who struggle with perfectionism need our support. They need our help. And it's our responsibility to provide them with that help, with that support. I hope you can find something in here that you can use, that you can do with your child or help your child with, help your student with, that can help them break out of that perfectionism. If you need to go see a counselor, if the perfectionism is so deeply ingrained, go see a counselor. Make sure it's a counselor who understands the needs of the gifted child, if that's who we're dealing with. But make sure that you help the child get the help they need, and you're not a barrier in any way to them being successful and feeling supportive. If you're looking for additional resources, here are the references I used when I did my research. I highly recommend Flett and Hewitt. They've done a ton of groundwork in terms of defining and giving voice to students with perfectionism. I also, again, suggest looking up Carol Dweck's work on the growth mindset and how you can support students and help them break out of their fixed mindset and look to improve and learn rather than looking only to achieve certain scores. I hope this presentation has been helpful for you. I appreciate your time. Go support the students that need you.